In one violent instant, the storm ripped open the earth between Esperanza and her twin foals, their terrified screams disappearing into the roar of floodwaters she could not cross. What this desperate mother did next, a solo journey through wolf territory and across mountains that should have killed her, would become the most extraordinary act of love anyone in San Marcos had ever witnessed. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Valley of San Marcos had always been a place of quiet beauty, where rolling hills met open meadows, and the distant mountains watched over the land like ancient guardians. It was here, on a modest ranch owned by an elderly widow named Elena Morales, that one of the most extraordinary horses in the region made her home. Her name was Esperanza, and she was unlike any horse the locals had ever seen. Standing at nearly 18 hands high, her chestnut coat gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight, and her cream-colored mane flowed like silk whenever she moved. But it was not her size or her beauty that made Esperanza remarkable. It was her heart, a heart so vast and loving that everyone who knew her swore she understood human emotions better than most people did. Elena had owned Esperanza for 12 years, ever since the mare was a young filly abandoned by a traveling merchant who could no longer afford to feed her. From the moment Elena took her in, Esperanza had proven herself to be more than just an animal. She was a companion, a protector, and in many ways, a daughter to the childless widow. The two had weathered countless storms together, both literal and figurative, and their bond had only grown stronger with each passing year. But nothing had prepared either of them for the storm that was about to change everything. That spring, Esperanza had given birth to twin foals, a miracle that the local veterinarian said happened only once in every 10,000 births. The foals, a male named Trueno and a female named Luna, were the pride of Elena's heart. Trueno was bold and spirited, always the first to explore new corners of the pasture, while Luna was gentle and curious, preferring to stay close to her mother's side. Together, the three horses formed an inseparable family unit, and Elena often spent her evenings watching them from her porch, marveling at the tenderness with which Esperanza cared for her young ones. The summer had been unusually dry that year, with barely a drop of rain falling on the parched earth for months. The farmers in San Marcos worried about their crops, and the ranchers fretted over their livestock, but no one anticipated what was coming. The meteorologists had warned of a storm approaching from the south, but their predictions had vastly underestimated its ferocity. When the first clouds appeared on the horizon that August afternoon, they were not the gentle gray puffs that usually announced a welcome rainfall. They were black and menacing, rolling across the sky like an army of shadows, swallowing the sunlight and casting the valley into an eerie twilight. Elena had been in town that day, purchasing supplies at the general store, when the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, the drizzle transformed into a torrential downpour, the kind that turned roads into rivers and visibility into nothing more than a few feet ahead. She rushed home as quickly as her old truck would allow, her heart pounding with worry for her animals. When she finally arrived at the ranch, what she saw made her blood run cold. The usually peaceful creek that bordered her property had swollen into a raging torrent, its muddy waters rising higher with each passing second. Esperanza stood at the edge of the flooded creek bed, her massive body trembling as she stared across the churning water. On the other side, separated by what had become an impassable chasm of rushing floodwater, stood Trueno and Luna. The foals were huddled together, their small bodies shaking with fear, their terrified whinnies barely audible over the roar of the storm. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the scene in brief, horrifying flashes, and Elena could see the raw panic in Esperanza's eyes as the mare paced back and forth along the water's edge. What happened next would haunt Elena for the rest of her days. In the chaos of the storm, as the floodwaters continued to rise and the ground beneath them became unstable, a section of the bank had collapsed, creating a deep ravine between the main pasture and the lower meadow where the foals had been grazing. Esperanza had been in the barn when the collapse occurred, and by the time she reached the edge of the newly formed gulf, it was too late. Her babies were stranded on the other side, and there was nothing she could do to reach them. Elena ran to Esperanza's side, grabbing hold of her halter and trying to calm the frantic mare. She could feel the horse's muscles trembling beneath her touch, could see the desperation in those large, intelligent eyes. Esperanza let out a whinny that sounded almost human in its anguish, a cry that spoke of a mother's worst nightmare realized. She tried to step into the water, but the current was too strong, and Elena had to use all her strength to hold her back. If Esperanza attempted to cross that torrent, she would be swept away and drowned within seconds. The storm raged on through the night, showing no signs of mercy. Elena managed to get Esperanza into the barn, but the mare refused to eat or drink. She stood at the barn door, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside, listening for any sound of her foals through the howling wind. Every few minutes, she would let out a mournful call, and Elena could hear the faint, distant responses of Trueno and Luna, confirming that they were still alive but impossibly far away. By morning, the rain had finally stopped, but the damage was devastating. The creek had carved a new path through Elena's property, creating a ravine nearly 30 feet wide and filled with fast-moving water that showed no signs of receding. The bridges that had once connected the different sections of the ranch were gone, washed away by the flood. Elena stood at the edge of the destruction, her heart heavy with despair, wondering how she would ever reunite Esperanza with her foals. But when she turned to look at the mare, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. There was a fire in Esperanza's eyes, a determination that Elena had never seen before. The mare was not going to accept this separation. She was going to find her babies, no matter what it took. The first rays of sunlight that broke through the dissipating clouds revealed the full extent of the devastation. Elena walked the perimeter of her property with a heavy heart, surveying the damage that the storm had wrought upon her small ranch. Fences lay scattered like broken bones across the muddy earth, and several of her outbuildings had lost their roofs to the violent winds. But none of that mattered to her as much as the sight of her horses, separated by a chasm that seemed to grow more impassable with each moment she stared at it. On the far side of the ravine, she could just barely make out the shapes of Trueno and Luna, huddled beneath a cluster of oak trees that had somehow survived the tempest. Esperanza had not slept. Elena could tell by the way the mare's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, by the nervous energy that coursed through her powerful body every time she heard the distant calls of her foals. The bond between a mother horse and her offspring was something that Elena had witnessed many times over her years as a rancher, but she had never seen anything quite like this. Esperanza seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in a way that went beyond mere animal instinct. There was intelligence in her gaze, a problem-solving quality that made Elena believe the mare was actively searching for a solution. That morning, as Elena tried to assess her options, Esperanza began to act strangely. The mare walked the entire length of the ravine, from one end of Elena's property to the other, her nose close to the ground, as if she were following an invisible trail. She paused at certain points, sniffing the air and looking across the churning water toward her foals. Elena watched with growing fascination as Esperanza repeated this journey several times, each pass seeming more purposeful than the last. It was as if the horse was mapping the terrain in her mind, searching for any possible route that might lead her back to her babies. By midday, help began to arrive. Word of the storm's destruction had spread through San Marcos, and neighbors came with trucks and equipment to assist with the cleanup. Among them was Miguel Santos, a young man who had grown up on the neighboring ranch and who had always had a special connection with horses. When he saw Esperanza pacing along the edge of the ravine, her mane tangled and her coat streaked with mud, his heart went out to her immediately. He approached Elena with concern etched across his features and asked what had happened. When she explained how the storm had separated the mare from her foals, Miguel's expression grew somber. The situation was worse than anyone had initially realized. The local authorities had closed all the roads leading out of the valley due to flooding and landslides, which meant that professional rescue equipment could not reach them for at least several days. The ravine itself was too unstable to build a temporary bridge across, and the water level, though it had dropped slightly since the storm's peak, was still far too dangerous to attempt any kind of crossing. Elena felt a wave of helplessness wash over her as she contemplated the possibility that her horses might remain separated for an entire week or more. But Esperanza was not willing to wait. As the humans discussed their limited options, the mare had continued her investigation of the landscape. She had traveled far beyond the boundaries of Elena's property now, following the course of the swollen creek as it wound its way through the valley. Several times, Elena sent Miguel to bring her back, worried that the horse might injure herself on the treacherous terrain. But each time Esperanza was returned to the barn, she would find a way to escape again, her determination seemingly inexhaustible. It was late afternoon when Miguel came running back to the farmhouse, breathless and wide-eyed with amazement. He grabbed Elena by the arm and led her to the western edge of the property, where the land sloped downward toward a narrow canyon that most people avoided due to its rocky and unstable footing. There, standing at the mouth of the canyon, was Esperanza. But she was not alone. Behind her stood old Don Ramiro, a hermit who lived in a small cabin deep in the mountains and who rarely ventured down to interact with the other residents of San Marcos. Don Ramiro was a man of few words, but what he told Elena and Miguel that day would change the course of everything. He explained that there was an old path through the mountains, a route that had been used by shepherds decades ago, before the main roads were built. The path was treacherous and required navigating several miles of rough terrain, including a crossing over a narrow natural bridge that spanned a deep gorge. Most horses would never attempt such a journey, and most humans would consider it foolhardy to try. But Don Ramiro had watched Esperanza approach the mouth of the canyon, and he had seen something in her eyes that convinced him she was no ordinary horse. Elena listened to the old man's words with a mixture of hope and fear. The path he described sounded incredibly dangerous, especially for a horse traveling alone. There were loose rocks that could give way without warning, steep inclines that would test even the strongest legs, and predators in the mountains that might see a lone mare as an easy target. But when Elena looked at Esperanza, when she saw the unwavering resolve in the horse's dark eyes, she knew that trying to stop her would be futile. This mother was going to find her children, regardless of the obstacles in her way. That night, as the sun set over the damaged valley and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elena made a decision that went against every instinct she had as a rancher. She would let Esperanza go. She would trust in the mare's intelligence and determination, and she would pray that somehow, against all odds, this incredible horse would find her way through the mountains and back to her foals. As she removed Esperanza's halter and opened the gate to the canyon path, Elena whispered a blessing into the mare's ear. Esperanza nuzzled her gently, as if thanking her for understanding, and then turned toward the mountains. With one final look back at the only home she had ever known, the giant chestnut mare began her journey into the unknown. The mountain path that stretched before Esperanza was nothing like the gentle meadows she had known all her life. The ground beneath her hooves was uneven and treacherous, littered with loose stones that shifted dangerously with every step she took. The air grew thinner as she climbed higher, and the familiar scents of Elena's ranch gave way to the wild, untamed fragrance of pine forests and distant snow. But none of these challenges could deter the determined mare. With each step forward, she carried the memory of her foals in her heart, their frightened whinnies echoing in her mind like a beacon calling her home. The first night of her journey was the hardest. As darkness fell over the mountains, Esperanza found herself alone in a way she had never experienced before. The sounds of the wilderness surrounded her, strange and threatening, from the distant howl of coyotes to the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. She had always been protected by the safety of Elena's barn, by the presence of other animals, and the comforting routines of ranch life. Now there was nothing between her and the vast, indifferent wilderness, but her own courage and the burning need to reach her babies. She found shelter that night beneath a rocky overhang, pressing her massive body against the cold stone and trying to conserve what warmth she could. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of Trueno and Luna, their small faces looking up at her with trust and love. In her dreams, she could feel them nuzzling against her side, could hear their soft breathing as they slept peacefully under her watchful gaze. When she woke to the gray light of dawn, the ache of their absence was almost unbearable. But she rose to her feet, shook the dust from her coat, and continued on her way. The second day brought new challenges that tested Esperanza's resolve in ways she could never have anticipated. The path Don Ramiro had spoken of was barely visible in many places, overgrown with thorny bushes and blocked by fallen trees that had been brought down by the recent storm. Several times, Esperanza had to backtrack and find alternative routes around obstacles that would have stopped a lesser horse in her tracks. Her legs grew weary from the constant climbing, and her hooves began to ache from the rough terrain. But she pressed on, driven by a force greater than physical exhaustion. It was midday when she encountered the first truly dangerous obstacle of her journey. The path ahead narrowed dramatically, squeezing between two massive boulders before dropping away into a steep descent. Below the narrow passage, Esperanza could see a river raging through a rocky gorge, its white waters churning with deadly force. One wrong step on this treacherous stretch would send her tumbling down the cliff face to certain death. For the first time since leaving Elena's ranch, Esperanza hesitated. She stood at the edge of the narrow passage, her nostrils flaring as she assessed the danger before her. For several long minutes, the mare remained motionless, her intelligent eyes studying every inch of the path ahead. She could turn back, find another route, perhaps wait for the humans to figure out a solution. But deep in her heart, she knew that every moment of delay was a moment her foals spent alone and afraid, separated from their mother in a world that suddenly seemed very large and very frightening. With a deep breath that seemed to gather all her courage into a single moment of determination, Esperanza stepped forward onto the narrow ledge. Her hooves found purchase on the rocky surface with a precision that spoke of instincts honed over thousands of years of evolution. Each step was calculated, careful, deliberate. she kept her massive body pressed against the inner wall of the passage, as far from the deadly drop as possible. The sound of the rushing water below filled her ears, a constant reminder of what awaited her if she made even the smallest mistake. But she did not falter. Step by step, inch by inch, she made her way across the treacherous passage, until finally, mercifully, the path widened again, and she found herself on solid ground. The relief that flooded through her body was almost overwhelming. She stood for a moment, her flanks heaving with exertion, and allowed herself a brief rest before continuing. But her respite was interrupted by a sound that made her blood run cold. From somewhere in the forest behind her came the unmistakable howl of wolves. Esperanza's ears flattened against her head, and every muscle in her body tensed with primal fear. She had never encountered wolves before, but something deep in her genetic memory recognized that sound as the cry of a predator, a creature that would see her not as a noble mare on a desperate mission, but as prey to be hunted and devoured. She began to move faster, abandoning caution in favor of speed. The path descended now, winding down through a dense forest of pine trees that blocked out much of the sunlight. Esperanza's hooves pounded against the earth as she pushed herself to maintain a pace that would keep her ahead of any pursuers. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a drum. Behind her, the howling grew closer, and she could hear now the sound of multiple animals crashing through the underbrush. Just when she thought her strength might give out, the forest opened up before her into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of an old stone structure, perhaps an abandoned shepherd's hut from the days Don Ramiro had described. Without hesitation, Esperanza made for the ruins, squeezing her large body through a gap in the crumbling walls. Inside, she pressed herself against the far corner and stood absolutely still, her ears straining to detect any sound of the approaching wolves. The pack arrived moments later, their gray shapes materializing from the shadows of the forest like ghosts. There were 5 of them, lean and hungry, their yellow eyes scanning the clearing for the prey they had been pursuing. Esperanza watched them through a crack in the stone wall, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. The wolves circled the ruins, sniffing at the air and growling low in their throats. But the walls, though ancient and crumbling, held firm. After what felt like an eternity, the pack leader let out a frustrated howl and led his companions back into the forest in search of easier prey. Esperanza remained in her hiding place until long after the sounds of the wolves had faded into silence, and only then did she allow herself to breathe again. Dawn broke over the mountains with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the terrors of the night before. Esperanza emerged from the ruined shepherd's hut slowly, her senses alert to any lingering danger. The clearing was empty now, the wolves long gone in pursuit of other prey, and the forest around her had settled into the peaceful quiet of early morning. Birds sang in the treetops, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from some distant meadow. For a brief moment, the world seemed almost kind again, but Esperanza did not allow herself to be lulled into complacency. She knew that her journey was far from over, and that more dangers likely awaited her on the path ahead. With a soft snort that seemed to steel her resolve, she stepped out of the ruins and began to walk once more. Her legs were stiff from the cramped position she had maintained throughout the night, and her muscles ached with a deep weariness that no amount of rest seemed able to cure. But the thought of Trueno and Luna, alone and frightened on the other side of these mountains, gave her the strength to continue. The terrain began to change as she traveled deeper into the heart of the mountain range. The dense pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation, and the air grew noticeably colder. Esperanza found herself climbing higher and higher, following a path that was now little more than a faint suggestion in the landscape. Several times she had to rely purely on her instincts to guide her, choosing directions based on some inner compass that seemed to point unfailingly toward her foals. It was as if an invisible thread connected her to her babies, a bond so powerful that not even mountains could sever it. By midday, she reached a plateau that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. From this vantage point, Esperanza could see the winding course of the river that had flooded during the storm. Its waters now calmer, but still swollen beyond their normal banks. She could see the patchwork of farms and ranches that made up San Marcos, tiny and insignificant from this height. And somewhere out there, hidden by distance and the curve of the earth, were her children. The mare stood on that plateau for a long moment, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she might somehow catch a glimpse of them. Then, with renewed determination, she turned and continued on her way. The afternoon brought her to the obstacle Don Ramiro had warned Elena about, the natural bridge that spanned a deep gorge. When Esperanza first laid eyes on it, her heart nearly stopped. The bridge was nothing more than a narrow strip of rock, perhaps 3 feet wide at its broadest point, stretching across a chasm so deep that its bottom was lost in shadow. The wind howled through the gorge, creating updrafts that could easily unbalance even the most sure-footed creature. Far below, Esperanza could hear the faint roar of water, a river that had carved this canyon over countless millennia. She approached the edge of the gorge with caution, her hooves testing the stability of the ground beneath her. The rock felt solid enough, but appearances could be deceiving in these mountains. She had already learned that lesson on the narrow ledge the day before. For several minutes, Esperanza simply stood at the entrance to the natural bridge, her body trembling slightly as she contemplated the crossing. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to turn back, to find another way, to abandon this foolish quest before it cost her life. But then she heard something that changed everything. Carried on the wind, so faint that it might have been nothing more than her imagination, came the distant sound of a whinny. It was high and plaintive, the call of a young horse crying out for its mother. Whether it was Trueno or Luna, whether it was real or merely a phantom conjured by her desperate heart, Esperanza would never know. But in that moment, it did not matter. That sound, real or imagined, reminded her of why she was here, of what she was fighting for. With a courage that defied all reason, Esperanza stepped onto the natural bridge. The rock was cold beneath her hooves, and she could feel it tremble slightly with each step she took. The wind tore at her mane and tail, trying to throw her off balance, but she lowered her head and pressed forward with grim determination. She did not look down into the abyss that yawned on either side of her. She did not think about what would happen if she fell. She thought only of her foals, of holding them close again, of the warmth of their small bodies pressed against her side. The crossing seemed to take an eternity. Every step was a victory. Every inch of progress a triumph over the fear that threatened to paralyze her. Halfway across, a gust of wind struck her with such force that she staggered, her hooves slipping momentarily on the smooth rock. For one heart-stopping instant, she felt herself tilting toward the void. But some miraculous combination of strength and balance saved her, and she managed to right herself before disaster struck. She stood frozen in the middle of the bridge, her entire body shaking with terror, until the wind died down enough for her to continue. When she finally reached the other side, Esperanza collapsed onto solid ground, her legs giving out beneath her. She lay there for a long time, her flanks heaving with exhaustion and relief, unable to believe that she had actually survived. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She knew she needed to find shelter before nightfall, but for the moment, all she could do was lie there and breathe, savoring the simple miracle of being alive. As darkness fell over the mountains, Esperanza dragged herself to her feet and found a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang. She was closer now. She could feel it in her bones. The thread that connected her to her foals seemed stronger here, more tangible. Tomorrow, if fortune smiled upon her, she might finally reach the other side of the mountains. Tomorrow she might see her babies again. With that hope warming her heart against the cold mountain night, Esperanza closed her eyes and allowed herself to dream of the reunion that awaited her. The 5th day of Esperanza's journey began with a sight that filled her weary heart with hope. As she emerged from her shelter beneath the rocky overhang, she found herself looking down upon a valley that stretched toward the east, bathed in the soft golden light of the rising sun. The terrain ahead was gentler than what she had traversed over the past days, with rolling hills covered in tall grass and scattered groves of trees that promised shade and perhaps even water. More importantly, she recognized something in the shape of the distant horizon, a familiar silhouette that told her she was finally approaching the other side of the mountains. Her body protested as she began to descend into the valley. The days of travel through treacherous terrain had taken their toll, and every muscle ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that made each step feel like a monumental effort. Her hooves were cracked and sore from the rocky paths she had navigated, and her once gleaming coat was now dull and matted with dust and sweat. But none of these physical hardships could diminish the fire that burned in her heart. She was close now, so close that she could almost taste the reunion with her foals. The descent took most of the morning, and by the time Esperanza reached the valley floor, the sun was high overhead. She found a small stream trickling through the grass and approached it gratefully, lowering her head to drink deeply of the cool, clear water. It was the first proper water source she had encountered since leaving Elena's ranch, and she drank until her thirst was finally quenched. Then she stood in the shallows for a while, letting the cold water soothe her aching hooves, and allowed herself a moment of rest. As she stood there, something caught her attention. A scent carried on the breeze, faint but unmistakable. It was the smell of horses, not wild horses that roamed these mountains, but domestic ones. Her nostrils flared as she tried to identify the source, her ears swiveling to catch any sound that might accompany the scent. And then she heard it, the distant whinny of a young horse, high and clear and achingly familiar. It was Luna. Esperanza would have recognized that sound anywhere, the particular pitch and timbre that belonged to her daughter alone. The effect on Esperanza was immediate and electric. All traces of exhaustion vanished as adrenaline surged through her veins. She leaped out of the stream and began to gallop across the valley, her powerful legs eating up the distance with a speed she had not known she still possessed. The grass whipped against her flanks as she ran, and the wind sang in her ears, but she paid no attention to anything except the direction of that precious sound. Her baby was calling for her, and nothing in this world or any other could stop her from answering. The valley gave way to a series of low hills, and Esperanza climbed them without slowing her pace. Her breath came in great heaving gasps, and her heart pounded against her ribs like a wild thing trying to escape. But she did not stop. She could not stop, not when she was so close. At the top of the highest hill, she paused for just a moment to scan the landscape ahead, and what she saw made her heart soar with joy. There, in a meadow at the base of the hills, stood a small farmhouse surrounded by wooden fences, and within those fences she could see two young horses, one bold and spirited, pacing along the fence line, and one gentle and curious, standing near the gate as if waiting for something. Trueno and Luna, her babies. They were alive, they were safe, and they were so close that she could almost reach out and touch them. But her joy was tempered by confusion. How had her foals come to be at this strange farm so far from Elena's ranch? The storm had separated them on opposite sides of a flooded ravine, not transported them across the mountains. Something did not make sense, and for a moment Esperanza hesitated, uncertain of what she was seeing. But then Luna raised her head and looked directly at the hilltop where Esperanza stood, and the young mare let out a whinny of recognition that erased all doubt from her mother's mind. Esperanza descended the hill at a full gallop, her hooves thundering against the earth as she raced toward the farmhouse. She could see Luna pressing against the fence now, her small body trembling with excitement. And Trueno had joined his sister, both foals calling out to their mother with voices full of desperate longing. The sound of their cries was the sweetest music Esperanza had ever heard, a symphony of love and relief that made all the hardships of her journey worthwhile. She reached the fence and skidded to a halt, her chest heaving with exertion. Luna immediately thrust her nose through the wooden slats, nuzzling against her mother's face with an urgency that spoke of days of fear and loneliness. Trueno, not to be outdone, pushed his way beside his sister, demanding his share of attention. Esperanza lowered her great head and breathed in the scent of her foals, that familiar, beloved smell that she had carried in her heart throughout her entire journey. Tears, if horses could cry them, would have streamed down her face in that moment. For several long minutes, the three horses simply stood there, pressed together through the fence, reacquainting themselves with each other's presence. Esperanza ran her nose along Luna's neck, checking for injuries, then did the same with Trueno. Both foals seemed healthy and unharmed, if somewhat thinner than when she had last seen them. Someone had been caring for them, that much was clear, but the fence that separated them was still a barrier, and Esperanza began to pace along its length, searching for a way to reach her babies. It was then that the door of the farmhouse opened and a figure stepped out onto the porch. Esperanza froze, her protective instincts flaring at the sight of this stranger. The person was an older man, weathered and bent by years of hard work, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners as he took in the scene before him. He did not seem surprised to see the giant mare standing at his fence. In fact, he seemed almost as if he had been expecting her. The old man stood on his porch for a long moment, simply observing the scene before him with an expression of quiet wonder. He had lived in these mountains for more than 60 years, and in all that time he had witnessed many remarkable things, but nothing had quite prepared him for the sight of this magnificent mare, clearly exhausted and battered from a long journey, standing at his fence and reuniting with the two foals he had rescued from the floodwaters days ago. His name was Aurelio Vega, and though he lived a solitary life far from the bustle of San Marcos, he was about to become part of a story that would be told for generations. Aurelio descended the porch steps slowly, his aged bones protesting with each movement. He approached the fence with caution, not wanting to startle the protective mother, who watched his every step with wary eyes. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and addressed Esperanza as if she were a person who could understand his every word. "You have come a long way to find them," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age. "I wondered if you would. When I pulled them from the water, I saw something in their eyes, a certainty that their mother would come for them. I did not know if it was possible, but here you are. Esperanza's ears flickered at the sound of his voice, but she did not retreat. There was something in the old man's tone that soothed her instincts, a kindness that seemed as natural to him as breathing. She watched as he moved to the gate and began to unlatch it, her body tensing with anticipation. When the gate swung open, she did not hesitate. She walked through the opening and immediately went to her foals, lowering her head to nuzzle them properly for the first time since the storm had torn them apart. The reunion was everything Esperanza had dreamed of during those long, difficult days in the mountains. Luna pressed herself against her mother's side, trembling with a mixture of relief and residual fear, while Trueno circled around them both, his youthful energy barely contained despite the ordeal he had been through. Esperanza stood perfectly still, allowing her foals to reassure themselves of her presence, her great heart swelling with a love so powerful it seemed to transcend the boundaries of her physical form. She was whole again. Her family was together. Aurelio watched the reunion with tears forming in his weathered eyes. He had seen much suffering in his life, had experienced loss and hardship that would have broken lesser men. But moments like this, moments of pure love and miraculous reunion, reminded him why life was worth living despite all its cruelties. He waited until the initial intensity of the reunion had passed before speaking again, his voice gentle so as not to intrude upon the sacred moment. The storm came without warning, he explained, moving slowly toward Esperanza as he spoke. I was checking my fences when I heard their cries. They were being carried downstream by the floodwaters, struggling to keep their heads above the surface. I managed to pull them out just before the current would have taken them over the falls. Aurelio paused, the memory of that desperate rescue still fresh in his mind. They were frightened and confused, but I could see they were well-bred, well-loved. I knew someone must be searching for them, so I kept them safe and waited. Esperanza listened to the old man's words, and though she could not understand them in the way a human would, she sensed their meaning. This stranger had saved her babies when she could not, had sheltered them and cared for them until she could complete her impossible journey. The gratitude she felt was beyond expression, but she tried to convey it anyway, reaching out her nose to gently touch Aurelio's weathered hand. The old man smiled, understanding the gesture for what it was. Over the next several hours, Aurelio provided Esperanza with food, water, and a place to rest. He could see that her journey had pushed her to the very limits of her endurance, and he insisted that she recover her strength before attempting the return trip to Elena's ranch. The mare was reluctant at first, her instinct to return home immediately warring with her body's desperate need for rest. But when Luna curled up beside her in the soft hay of Aurelio's barn, and Trueno settled on her other side, Esperanza allowed herself to accept the old man's hospitality. As night fell over the mountain farmstead, Aurelio sat on his porch and contemplated the extraordinary events of the day. He had lived alone since his wife passed away 10 years ago, and the solitude had become comfortable to him. But tonight, with the sound of horses breathing peacefully in his barn, he felt a warmth in his heart that he had almost forgotten existed. He thought about Elena Morales, whom he had met only once, many years ago at a market in San Marcos. She had been a young woman then, full of life and hope. He wondered if she knew that her beloved mare had survived the treacherous mountain crossing, if she was even now praying for Esperanza's safe return. The following morning, Aurelio made a decision. He would accompany Esperanza and her foals on their journey back to San Marcos. The path through the mountains was dangerous, as the mare's battered condition clearly demonstrated, and the foals were too young to navigate such terrain alone. Besides, he had not left his mountain home in nearly 5 years, and perhaps it was time to reconnect with the world he had left behind. He packed a small bag with provisions, saddled his old mule, and prepared for the journey. Esperanza seemed to understand what was happening. When Aurelio opened the barn doors and gestured toward the mountain path, she emerged with her foals close beside her, her eyes bright with renewed determination. She was still tired, still sore from her ordeal, but the prospect of returning home gave her strength that transcended physical limitations. With Aurelio leading the way on his mule, and Trueno and Luna safely flanked by their mother's protective presence, the small caravan began the long journey back to San Marcos. The mountains that had seemed so threatening during Esperanza's desperate crossing now appeared almost welcoming. The sun shone brightly overhead, and the path, though still challenging, seemed less treacherous with a knowledgeable guide leading the way. For the first time since the storm had shattered her world, Esperanza allowed herself to believe that everything would be all right. The journey back through the mountains was nothing like Esperanza's desperate solo crossing. With Aurelio's steady guidance and the comforting presence of her foals at her side, the treacherous terrain seemed somehow less menacing. The old man knew these mountains intimately, having spent his entire life wandering their hidden paths and secret valleys. He led the small group along routes that Esperanza had never discovered during her frantic search, paths that were gentler and safer, though they added extra distance to the journey. Trueno and Luna stayed close to their mother throughout the trek, their youthful energy tempered by an instinctive understanding that this was not a time for play. They had been through an ordeal that had matured them beyond their young years, and though they could not articulate what they had experienced, the memory of those terrifying hours in the floodwaters remained fresh in their minds. Every so often, one of them would press against Esperanza's side, as if reassuring themselves that she was still there, that she had not vanished again into the chaos of the storm. On the second day of their return journey, the group reached the natural bridge that had nearly claimed Esperanza's life. Aurelio dismounted from his mule and approached the narrow span of rock with a critical eye. He had crossed this bridge many times over the years, but never with young foals in tow. The wind that whipped through the gorge was gentler today than it had been during Esperanza's crossing, but the danger was still very real. One wrong step, one moment of panic from the inexperienced foals, and tragedy could strike without warning. Aurelio turned to Esperanza with a serious expression. "We must cross one at a time," he explained. Though he knew the mare could not understand his words, he hoped she would understand his intention through his actions and tone. "I will go first with my mule to show the way. Then you must guide your little ones across, one by one. Can you do this, brave mother?" Esperanza's ears perked forward, and she seemed to comprehend the gravity of the situation. She nudged Luna gently away from the bridge's edge and positioned herself between her foals and the dangerous crossing, waiting for Aurelio's signal. The old man crossed first, his mule picking its way carefully across the narrow rock span. When he reached the other side safely, he turned and called out encouragement to Esperanza. The mare hesitated for only a moment before making her decision. She nuzzled Luna first, pushing her gently but firmly toward the bridge. The young filly trembled with fear, her eyes wide as she looked down into the dizzying depths of the gorge. But her mother's presence behind her was reassuring, and with Esperanza's nose pressed against her hindquarters, Luna began to cross. Each step seemed to take an eternity. Luna moved with painstaking slowness, her small hooves finding purchase on the narrow rock with an instinctive precision that belied her youth. Esperanza followed close behind, her body positioned to block her daughter's view of the terrifying drop on either side. When Luna finally reached the safety of solid ground on the far side, she let out a whinny of relief that echoed through the gorge like a celebration. Aurelio patted her neck reassuringly, while Esperanza turned back to fetch Trueno. The young colt was more confident than his sister, his bold nature refusing to show the fear that surely coursed through his veins. He crossed the bridge with a swagger that made Aurelio chuckle, despite the tension of the moment. But even Trueno's bravado faltered halfway across when a sudden gust of wind caught him off guard. He stumbled, his front legs buckling slightly, and for one heart-stopping instant, it seemed he might tumble into the abyss. But Esperanza was there in an instant, her massive body providing a living wall between her son and the deadly drop. She pressed against him, steadying him with her strength, and together they completed the crossing without further incident. Once all four horses and the old man were safely on the other side, Aurelio allowed himself a deep breath of relief. "That was the hardest part," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cool mountain air. "From here, the path grows easier. We should reach the valley by tomorrow evening if we maintain a good pace." Esperanza seemed to understand, and she gathered her foals close before following Aurelio down the gentler slopes that led toward home. That night, they made camp in a sheltered grove, where a small spring provided fresh water, and the trees offered protection from the wind. Aurelio built a small fire and sat beside it, watching the flames dance while the horses rested nearby. Esperanza lay on the soft grass with Luna curled against her belly, and Trueno stretched out beside her flank. The sight of the reunited family, so peaceful after all they had endured, filled the old man's heart with a warmth that rivaled the fire's glow. As he watched them sleep, Aurelio found himself thinking about the nature of love and sacrifice. This mare had crossed mountains filled with danger, had faced wolves and treacherous terrain and the very real possibility of death, all to find her children. She had not calculated the odds or weighed the risks against the potential rewards. She had simply acted on the purest instinct a mother could possess: the need to protect and reunite with her offspring. In a world that often seemed cold and indifferent, such love was a beacon of hope. The fire crackled softly as Aurelio added another branch to keep it burning through the night. He thought about Elena Morales, waiting back in San Marcos, probably sick with worry over the fate of her beloved mare. He thought about the joy she would feel when Esperanza finally came home, not alone, but with her foals safe and sound. And he thought about his own place in this story, how fate had put him in the right place at the right time to save two young lives, and now guide their family back together. "Tomorrow," he whispered to the sleeping horses, "tomorrow we continue. And soon you will be home." Esperanza's ear twitched at the sound of his voice, but she did not wake. In her dreams, she was already back at Elena's ranch, standing in the familiar pasture with her foals playing around her, the nightmare of the storm finally fading into distant memory. The final day of the journey dawned clear and bright, with not a single cloud marring the endless blue expanse of the sky. It was as if nature itself was apologizing for the terrible storm that had caused so much destruction and heartache, offering this perfect day as a gesture of reconciliation. Esperanza rose with the sun, her body still stiff from the long days of travel, but her spirit lifted by the knowledge that home was finally within reach. She nuzzled her foals awake, and they responded with the enthusiasm of youth, seemingly unaffected by the hardships they had endured. Aurelio prepared for the final leg of their journey with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. He had grown attached to these horses over the past few days, had come to admire Esperanza's unwavering devotion and delight in the playful personalities of her foals. Soon he would deliver them safely to their rightful owner, and his role in their story would come to an end. It was the right thing to do, he knew, but part of him wished the journey could last just a little longer. The descent from the mountains into the valley of San Marcos was gradual and scenic. The harsh rocky terrain gave way to rolling hills covered with wildflowers, and the air grew warmer and sweeter as they dropped in elevation. Trueno and Luna, sensing that something significant was approaching, became increasingly energetic, racing ahead and then circling back to their mother with excited whinnies. Esperanza tolerated their antics with patient affection, though she never let them stray too far from her watchful gaze. By midday, they reached a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. Aurelio brought the group to a halt and gestured toward the landscape spread out below them. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "That is San Marcos, and somewhere down there is your home." Esperanza's ears pricked forward, and she let out a long, low whinny that seemed to carry all the longing and hope of her incredible journey. She recognized this view, had seen it many times from Elena's ranch. They were so close now that she could almost smell the familiar sense of home. The news of their approach had somehow preceded them. As the small caravan made its way down the final slopes toward the valley floor, they began to encounter people along the road. Farmers paused in their work to stare at the magnificent mare and her foals, their faces lighting up with recognition and wonder. Word spread quickly from one homestead to the next, and soon a small crowd had gathered to witness the return of Esperanza and her miraculous reunion with her babies. Among those who heard the news was Miguel Santos, the young man who had helped Elena in the aftermath of the storm. He had been repairing fences on his family's property when a neighbor came running with the incredible tale. At first, Miguel refused to believe it. He had seen the treacherous mountains, had understood the impossible odds facing any creature that attempted to cross them alone. But the neighbor insisted, and curiosity compelled Miguel to mount his horse and ride toward the approaching group. When he saw Esperanza with his own eyes, Miguel felt tears streaming down his face. The mare looked different than he remembered, thinner and more weathered, her once gleaming coat dulled by the hardships of her journey. But her eyes were the same, those intelligent, determined eyes that had always seemed to see more than an ordinary horse should. And there, walking beside her, were Trueno and Luna, the foals that everyone had assumed were lost forever to the floodwaters. Miguel rode alongside the group as they continued toward Elena's ranch, peppering Aurelio with questions about how this miracle had come to pass. The old man answered as best he could, describing how he had rescued the foals from the swollen river, and how Esperanza had somehow found her way to his remote mountain farmstead. But even as he spoke, Aurelio knew that words could never fully capture the magnitude of what had occurred. Some stories were too profound for language, too sacred to be reduced to mere explanation. As they approached Elena's property, the evidence of the storm's destruction became increasingly apparent. Fences still lay broken in many places, and the ravine that had separated Esperanza from her foals remained a gaping wound in the landscape. But there were also signs of recovery and rebuilding. New fence posts had been erected, and the debris had been cleared from most of the fields. The community had come together in the aftermath of the disaster, just as they always did, helping their neighbors rebuild what the storm had taken. Elena's farmhouse came into view, and Esperanza quickened her pace despite her exhaustion. She recognized every detail of this beloved place, from the weathered wooden porch to the ancient oak tree that shaded the front yard. This was where she had spent the happiest years of her life, where she had given birth to her precious foals, where she had formed an unbreakable bond with the kind woman who had rescued her so many years ago. Home. She was finally home. The commotion of their approach had drawn Elena from her house. She stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of the crowd that was moving toward her property. At first, she could not believe what she was seeing. Her mind, still burdened by grief and worry, refused to accept the evidence of her own eyes. But then she heard it, a familiar whinny that she would have recognized anywhere, the voice of the horse she loved more than anything in the world. Elena stepped off the porch, her legs trembling beneath her. She took one step, then another, her pace increasing until she was running across the yard toward the approaching horses. Esperanza saw her coming and broke into a gallop, leaving Aurelio and the foals behind in her eagerness to reach her beloved owner. The two met in the middle of the field, woman and horse, their reunion witnessed by dozens of neighbors who had gathered to see the miracle for themselves. Elena threw her arms around Esperanza's neck and buried her face in the mare's tangled mane, sobbing with a joy so profound that it seemed to transcend the boundaries of human emotion. "You came back," she whispered through her tears. "You found them, and you came back to me." The embrace between Elena and Esperanza seemed to last forever, though in reality it was only a few precious minutes. The crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, understanding that this moment belonged to the woman and her horse alone. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved beyond words by the scene unfolding before them. Others simply stood in silence, bearing witness to a reunion that would become the stuff of legend in San Marcos for generations to come. When Elena finally released her hold on Esperanza's neck, she stepped back to look at her beloved mare. What she saw made her heart ache with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The journey had clearly taken a terrible toll on Esperanza's body. Her ribs were visible beneath her dull coat, and her legs bore numerous cuts and scrapes from the rocky mountain terrain. Her hooves were cracked and worn, and her eyes, though still bright with intelligence and love, carried the shadow of exhaustion that comes from pushing oneself beyond all reasonable limits. But before Elena could fully process Esperanza's condition, she became aware of two smaller figures approaching. Luna and Trueno had caught up with their mother, and they now stood behind her, peering curiously at the woman who was crying and touching their mother's face. Elena's breath caught in her throat. As she saw them, these precious foals she had been certain were lost forever to the floodwaters. She sank to her knees in the grass, overwhelmed by emotion, and the foals approached her with the trusting curiosity of youth. Luna was the first to reach her, pressing her soft nose against Elena's tear-stained cheek. Trueno followed close behind, nudging her shoulder with the boldness that had always characterized his personality. Elena wrapped her arms around both foals, pulling them close as fresh tears streamed down her face. "My babies," she sobbed. "My beautiful babies. You came back to me. All of you came back." Esperanza stood over them protectively, her great head lowered to watch the reunion between her owner and her children. It was then that Aurelio approached, leading his old mule and wearing an expression of quiet satisfaction. He had hung back during the initial reunion, understanding that his presence was secondary to the main event. But now Elena looked up and noticed him for the first time, this stranger who had somehow become part of the most important moment of her life. She rose to her feet, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and walked toward him, with questions forming on her lips. "You are the one who saved them," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, born from an intuition that required no explanation. Aurelio nodded slowly, removing his worn hat in a gesture of respect. "I found the little ones in the river after the storm," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age. "I kept them safe and waited, hoping someone would come looking. But I never imagined their mother would cross the mountains alone to find them. That mare of yours has a heart unlike any I have ever known." Elena listened as Aurelio recounted the full story of Esperanza's arrival at his mountain farmstead, of her obvious exhaustion and the determination that had driven her across impossible terrain. With each detail, Elena's admiration for her horse grew deeper. She had always known that Esperanza was special, had recognized from the first moment she rescued her as a young filly that this was no ordinary animal. But this journey, this incredible feat of love and perseverance, exceeded anything she could have imagined. The crowd began to disperse as the afternoon wore on, though many lingered to offer their congratulations and assistance. The local veterinarian, Dr. Mendez, arrived and insisted on examining all 3 horses immediately. He worked methodically, checking Esperanza first, then moving on to the foals. His expression grew increasingly serious as he catalogued the mare's injuries and the toll the journey had taken on her body. "She needs rest," Dr. Mendez declared when he had completed his examination. "Extensive rest, good nutrition, and careful attention to these wounds. The cuts on her legs are at risk of infection, and her hooves will need time to heal properly. But she is strong, Elena, stronger than any horse I have ever treated. With proper care, she will make a full recovery." Elena nodded, her hand resting on Esperanza's neck, silently vowing to provide whatever her beloved mare needed. The foals, by contrast, were in remarkably good condition. Aurelio had cared for them well during their time at his farmstead, and apart from being slightly underweight, they showed no lasting effects from their ordeal in the floodwaters. Dr. Mendez praised the old man's caretaking abilities and recommended a simple regimen of good food and gentle exercise to restore the young horses to full health. As the sun began to set over San Marcos, casting long shadows across the damaged but recovering landscape, Elena invited Aurelio to stay for dinner. The old man hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the attention and eager to return to his solitary mountain life. But Elena insisted, and eventually Aurelio agreed to spend at least one night before making the journey back to his farmstead. That evening, seated at Elena's simple wooden table, the two shared a meal and conversation that bridged the gap between their very different lives. Elena learned about Aurelio's years of solitude in the mountains, about the wife he had lost, and the peace he had found in his remote existence. Aurelio learned about Elena's deep bond with Esperanza, about the day she had rescued the mare as an abandoned filly, and the years of companionship that had followed. Outside in the barn that Elena had hastily prepared for their arrival, Esperanza stood with her foals pressed close against her sides. The familiar smells of home surrounded her, the scent of hay and wood, and the particular fragrance of the land where she had spent most of her life. Her body ached with exhaustion, and her wounds throbbed with a dull pain that would take weeks to fully subside. But none of that mattered. Her babies were safe. They were home. And the nightmare that had begun with that terrible storm was finally, blessedly, over. Luna shifted in her sleep, pressing closer to her mother's warmth. Trueno snored softly, his youthful energy temporarily depleted by the long day of travel. Esperanza lowered her head and closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest truly for the first time since that fateful night when the floodwaters had torn her family apart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the long process of recovery. But tonight, there was only peace. The weeks that followed Esperanza's return were filled with healing, both for the horses and for the land that had been so devastated by the storm. Elena devoted herself entirely to the care of her beloved mare, spending hours each day tending to her wounds, preparing nutritious meals, and simply sitting beside her in the barn, offering the quiet companionship that Esperanza seemed to crave. The bond between woman and horse, already profound before the storm, deepened into something that transcended ordinary understanding. They had both faced the possibility of permanent loss, and having emerged on the other side, their connection had become unbreakable. Dr. Mendez visited regularly to monitor Esperanza's progress, and with each examination, his reports grew more optimistic. The cuts on her legs healed cleanly, leaving faint scars that would serve as permanent reminders of her incredible journey. Her hooves, carefully treated and allowed to rest, gradually regained their strength and soundness. And her coat, with proper nutrition and grooming, slowly returned to its former glory, the rich chestnut color gleaming once again in the sunlight. But it was the light in her eyes that told Elena the truest story of recovery, that spark of life and love that had dimmed during her ordeal but now burned brighter than ever before. Trueno and Luna flourished under Elena's care, growing stronger and more vibrant with each passing day. The trauma of their experience in the floodwaters seemed to fade from their young minds, replaced by the simple joys of youth, running through the pastures, playing with each other, and basking in the constant attention of their devoted mother. Esperanza watched over them with a vigilance that bordered on obsessive, never letting them stray too far from her sight. Elena understood this protective instinct and did nothing to discourage it. After what they had all been through, such caution was not only understandable but wise. Aurelio had returned to his mountain farmstead after spending 3 days at Elena's ranch, but he did not fade from their lives, as he had expected. Elena insisted on maintaining contact with the man who had saved her horses, and she made a point of visiting him every few months, bringing supplies and news from San Marcos. These visits became something Aurelio looked forward to with surprising eagerness, breaking the monotony of his solitary existence and reminding him that he was still connected to the wider world. In time, a genuine friendship developed between the elderly hermit and the widow, two souls who had found common ground through an extraordinary shared experience. The story of Esperanza's journey spread far beyond the boundaries of San Marcos. Travelers carried the tale to distant towns and cities, and soon people were making pilgrimages to Elena's ranch just to see the mare who had crossed the mountains to find her foals. Elena welcomed these visitors with gracious hospitality, allowing them to meet Esperanza and hear the story firsthand. She never tired of telling it, and each retelling seemed to deepen her appreciation for the miracle that had occurred. The visitors, in turn, left with a renewed sense of wonder at the power of maternal love and the extraordinary capabilities of animals when driven by devotion. As the months passed and the seasons changed, the ravine that had separated Esperanza from her foals gradually transformed. The community came together to build a sturdy bridge across the gap, ensuring that no family would ever be torn apart by flooding again. The bridge was named Puente Esperanza, a tribute to the Mare whose determination had inspired an entire valley. Elena attended the dedication ceremony with Esperanza and the foals at her side, tears streaming down her face as the mayor spoke of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living beings. The following spring brought new life to Elena's ranch. Esperanza, fully recovered from her ordeal, gave birth to another foal, a beautiful filly with her mother's chestnut coat and her father's spirited temperament. Elena named her Milagro, the Spanish word for miracle, because that was exactly what she represented. The birth was smooth and uncomplicated, a stark contrast to the drama that had surrounded the twins, and Elena watched with joy as Esperanza welcomed her newest offspring into the world, with the same tender devotion she had always shown. Trueno and Luna, now yearlings, accepted their new sister with the enthusiasm of youth. They took turns watching over her, mimicking their mother's protective behavior, and Elena often found herself laughing at their earnest attempts to parent the tiny foal. The pastures of her ranch, once scarred by the storm's destruction, now rang with the sounds of happy horses, a testament to the resilience of life and the healing power of time. Elena often sat on her porch in the evenings, watching her horses graze in the golden light of sunset. At such moments, she would think about all that had transpired since that terrible storm, about the fear and despair she had felt when she believed Esperanza and the foals were lost forever. And then she would think about the miracle of their return, about the impossible journey her mare had undertaken, and her heart would swell with a gratitude so profound that words could never capture it. Esperanza seemed to sense these moments of reflection. She would often lift her head from grazing and look toward the porch, her dark eyes meeting Elena's across the distance. In those gazes, entire conversations seemed to pass between them, communications that required no language, only the deep understanding that comes from years of shared life and mutual devotion. Elena would smile, and Esperanza would return to her grazing, satisfied that all was well with her human companion. Years later, when Elena was an old woman and Esperanza had passed peacefully in her sleep at the remarkable age of 32, the people of San Marcos would still tell the story of the giant mare who crossed the mountains to find her foals. They told it to their children and grandchildren, passing down the tale as a reminder that love knows no boundaries, that a mother's devotion can overcome any obstacle, and that miracles are possible for those who refuse to give up hope. And somewhere in the hearts of all who heard the story, a spark of that same determination was kindled, inspiring them to face their own impossible journeys with courage and faith. The legacy of Esperanza lived on, not just in the descendants she left behind or the bridge that bore her name, but in the countless lives touched by her story. She had been just a horse, some might say, but those who knew her understood that she was so much more. She was a symbol of everything beautiful and noble in the bond between animals and humans, a testament to the power of love, and an eternal reminder that the heart, when filled with purpose, can achieve the extraordinary. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment below. Let me know where you are watching from and how this tale of Esperanza touched your heart. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories about the incredible animals who share our world.